The coffee shop on 5th Street looks ordinary enough, bustling with morning commuters, the smell of fresh pastries, typical city noise. But the woman sitting across from me hasn't been in a place like this in 20 years. Sarah's eyes dart to every entrance, every face that passes by the window. She flinches when the barista drops a cup behind the counter. "They called it the Sacred Circle," she whispers, her voice barely audible over the espresso machine. To the outside world, we didn't exist. 43 children, taken from broken families, raised to serve their twisted prophecy. Sarah escaped 3 months ago from a compound hidden deep in the Montana wilderness. She's the first person to ever break free and live to tell about it. But freedom came with a terrible price. She left behind 12 other children, some now adults, still trapped in that nightmare. The sect leaders have eyes everywhere, she tells me. They've killed to keep their secrets buried, and now that Sarah has spoken out, she's marked for death. What drove a 14-year-old girl to risk everything for freedom after 2 decades of psychological imprisonment? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I lean forward, studying the woman before me. Sarah's prematurely grey hair is cropped short, uneven. She cut it herself with kitchen shears the night she fled. Her pale blue eyes hold an intensity that makes my skin crawl, not because they are threatening, but because they've seen things no human should witness. "Start from the beginning," I say gently, sliding my recorder closer. She stares at it like it might explode. "You have to understand," she begins, her fingers worrying the sleeve of an oversized sweater that probably belongs to the safe house where she's staying. "I wasn't kidnapped in the traditional sense. My mother handed me over willingly." The words hang in the air between us. Sarah's gaze drifts past my shoulder to the street beyond, where normal people live normal lives, oblivious to the horrors that exist just beyond their comfortable reality. She was desperate. Dad had left 6 months earlier, and Mom was drowning in debt, in addiction, in everything that comes with having nowhere to turn. Then they showed up, Brother Marcus and Sister Claire. They wore plain clothes, drove a regular sedan, looked like social workers or missionaries. Her voice takes on a mechanical quality, as if she's reciting facts to distance herself from the emotion. They told her they ran a retreat center for troubled youth, completely funded by donations, they said. I could get my education, learn valuable skills, become part of a loving community. All she had to do was sign some papers and trust that God had provided a solution to her problems. Sarah's laugh is bitter, hollow. The papers weren't guardianship documents, they were surrender forms. Once she signed, I legally ceased to exist as her daughter. I tried to process this information while maintaining my composure. How is that possible? The Sacred Circle had lawyers, accountants, judges, people in positions of power who either believed in their cause or were blackmailed into compliance. They'd perfected the system over decades. Take children from families that wouldn't be missed, families too broken or ashamed to fight back. The coffee shop seems to fade around us as Sarah's story draws me deeper into her world. She describes the compound, hundreds of acres surrounded by electrified fencing, disguised as a religious retreat to any curious outsiders. The children were divided by age groups, forbidden from forming attachments, constantly moved between dormitories to prevent bonds from forming. They called it spiritual purification, she continues, her voice growing stronger. But it was systematic psychological torture designed to break down our sense of self, our ability to think independently. We existed only to serve the prophecy. What prophecy? Sarah's entire body tenses. She glances around the coffee shop again, as if speaking the words might summon the very people she's hiding from. The Great Convergence. Brother Marcus claimed to receive visions from God, that the world would end in fire and chaos, but the Sacred Circle would survive to rebuild humanity. We children were being prepared as the foundation of the new world, the pure ones. Her hands shake as she reaches for her coffee cup, and I notice the faint scars circling her wrists. When she catches me looking, She quickly pulls her sleeves down. The older we got, the more specialized our training became. Boys learned agriculture, construction, weapons maintenance. Girls learned domestic skills, child rearing, and she pauses, swallowing hard, other duties required for repopulating the earth. The implication hits me like a physical blow. I want to reach across the table, to offer some gesture of comfort, but something in Sarah's posture tells me she's barely holding herself together as it is. 20 years, I say quietly. What finally made you run? Sarah meets my eyes for the first time since she began talking. What I see there is pure, undiluted terror, mixed with a determination that speaks to the incredible strength it must have taken to escape. They chose me for the final ritual. The coffee shop around us hummed with ordinary life. Students typing on laptops, a barista calling out drink names, the gentle clink of ceramic against wood. But Sarah's words had created an invisible barrier around our corner table, sealing us into a bubble of something far darker than the cheerful afternoon light streaming through the windows. "How long have you been out?" I asked, keeping my voice low. 3 years, 2 months, 16 days. The precision of her answer sent a chill down my spine. I count every one. She wrapped her fingers around her mug like it was an anchor. The coffee had gone cold, but she didn't seem to notice. The compound was in rural Montana. We called it Eden Valley, but the real name on the property records was probably something else entirely. Everything about that place was built on lies. Her eyes took on a distant quality, 67 souls living in what they told us was paradise. What I now know was a prison with no walls. No walls. When you're convinced that stepping outside means eternal damnation, when everyone you've ever loved is inside those boundaries, when you've never known anything else, she shrugged. You don't need walls. Fear is much more effective. I scribbled notes, though part of me wondered if I was documenting someone's truth or delusion. But the details, the way she described the daily routines, the hierarchy, the gradual erosion of individual identity, carried a weight that fiction couldn't fake. The prophet, that's what we called him, though his real name was Marcus Thorne. He had this way of making you feel special and worthless at the same time. Chosen but never good enough. Saved but always on the verge of losing salvation. She paused, pressing her lips together. I was 8 when my parents brought me there. By the time I was old enough to question anything, questioning itself had become unthinkable. What changed? What made you leave? For the first time since we'd started talking, something shifted in her expression. Not quite a smile, but close. Anna, another girl, about my age. She'd been born there, never knew the outside world existed until Sarah stopped, her hand moving unconsciously to her throat, until the prophet decided she was ready for her spiritual marriage. The euphemism hung in the air between us like smoke. She was 15, same as I was when he first started calling me to his private counseling sessions. The words came out flat, matter of fact, but I could see the effort it took to keep them that way. Anna couldn't accept it like I had learned to. She started asking questions, dangerous questions. What kind of questions? Whether the outside world was really full of demons, whether the prophet's visions were real, or if he was just a man who liked young girls, whether God really wanted us to live like this. Sarah's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Whether we could run. We planned it for months. Anna knew about a town about 20 miles south. She'd overheard some of the men talking about supply runs. We stole food, warm clothes, what little money we could find. And one night in November, when everyone was at evening prayer, we just walked away, just like that. Sarah's laugh held no humor, just like stepping off the edge of the world. We had no idea what money really meant, how to talk to strangers, what cars were capable of. Anna had never seen a television. I barely remembered them. She met my eyes. Imagine being 15 and learning that the moon landing actually happened, that there were more countries than you could count, more people than you could imagine, that women could have jobs and choose their husbands, and that most people thought what happened to us was not just wrong, but criminal. What happened to Anna? We made it to the town, found a police station, but Anna... Sarah's voice caught. She couldn't handle it. The noise, the lights, the sheer enormity of everything we'd been denied. She kept saying we'd made a mistake, that we needed to go back and ask for forgiveness. The social workers tried to help, but she wouldn't stay in the foster home they found. One morning, she was just gone. Did she go back? I don't know. I hope not, but... Sarah shook her head. The pull is so strong. Even now, sometimes I wake up and for just a moment, I think I'm back there. And there's this terrible part of me that feels almost relieved. Outside, clouds had gathered, casting the coffee shop in a different light. Sarah glanced toward the windows, then back at me. That's why I need someone to listen, to document this. Because if they find me, if something happens... She leaned forward. Someone needs to know the truth. The coffee shop's ambient noise seemed to fade as Sarah's words hung between us. I watched her fingers trace the rim of her untouched cup, the simple gold band on her ring finger catching the afternoon light. She'd mentioned a husband briefly, but something in her tone suggested that relationship carried its own complications. "Tell me about the day you escaped," I said, keeping my voice gentle but direct. After 15 years of investigative journalism, I'd learned that sometimes the only way forward was straight through the difficult questions. Sarah's eyes darted to the window again, scanning the street with practiced wariness. It wasn't really an escape. That's what makes it so terrifying. She pulled her cardigan tighter around her shoulders despite the warmth of the cafe. "They let me go." "Let you go?" "The children of divine light don't just release people, Rachel. Nobody leaves unless it serves their purpose." Her laugh was bitter, hollow. I was 28, had never been outside the compound alone, didn't even know how to use a credit card. But suddenly, Prophet Matthias called me to his study and told me I had a mission in the outside world. I leaned forward, my pen poised over the notepad. "What kind of mission?" "Marriage, integration. He said I was chosen to be a bridge between their world and ours." Sarah's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. They had already arranged everything. David, my husband, he had been corresponding with the group for months through their website. He thought he was rescuing me. The pieces began forming a disturbing picture in my mind. But he wasn't. David's a good man, a pediatric surgeon, devoutly religious, recently divorced. He genuinely believed he was offering sanctuary to someone who needed help. Sarah's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "He has no idea that our entire marriage was orchestrated by the cult, that every major decision we've made together has been influenced by instructions I receive." "Instructions? You mean they're still in contact with you?" Sarah reached into her purse and pulled out a simple flip phone, the kind that had been obsolete for years. She slid it across the table to me. "They gave me this before I left. It looks like nothing, but it receives encrypted messages, sometimes daily, sometimes weeks apart. They tell me where to live, what church to attend, which neighbors to befriend." I picked up the phone, examining its worn exterior. "Have you considered going to the police?" "With what evidence? Messages that delete themselves after being read? A story about a religious group that, on the surface, appears completely legitimate." Sarah shook her head. "The children of divine light have spent decades perfecting their public image. They run legitimate businesses, donate to charities, have connections in law enforcement and local government. But you kept records? Some, hidden where even David doesn't know about them." Sarah glanced around nervously before continuing. "Photos, documents, recordings when I could manage it. But Rachel, these people killed my mother in front of me when I was 12 because she questioned Prophet Matthias. They convinced me it was God's will. What do you think they'll do if they discover I'm talking to a journalist?" The weight of her revelation settled over me like a shroud. I'd covered dangerous stories before, corruption, organized crime, political scandals, but something about this felt different, more personal, more immediate. "Why now?" I asked. "Why are you coming forward after all these years?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment, her gaze fixed on something beyond the window. When she spoke, her voice carried a new urgency. "Because they're preparing for something big. The messages have changed in the past few months. more frequent, more specific. They're moving assets, relocating people, acquiring property in remote areas. What kind of property? Bunkers, underground facilities. They're stockpiling supplies like they're preparing for a siege. Sarah's hands were trembling again. And the children, Rachel. There are so many children there now, young ones, born into the group like I was. They're completely isolated from the outside world. I thought about my own daughter, safe at school, blissfully unaware of the darkness that existed in places like this. How many people are we talking about? The main compound in Montana has maybe 300 members, but there are smaller facilities scattered across at least 6 states. They've been growing steadily since I left. Sarah leaned across the table, her voice urgent. Something's coming. I can feel it. The messages are talking about the cleansing and the time of judgment. This isn't just about exposing past crimes. This is about preventing something catastrophic. I have to go soon, she said. David thinks I'm at a book club. But Rachel, I need you to understand. Once you start investigating this, there's no going back. They have eyes everywhere, and they don't forgive threats to their existence. I looked at this woman who had trusted me with her terrible secret, knowing that my next words would change both our lives forever. The coffee had gone cold between us, but neither of us seemed to notice. Sarah's revelation hung in the air like smoke, and I found myself leaning forward, drawn into her orbit of fear and desperation. Outside, the rain had started again, drumming against the windows of the small cafe with an intensity that seemed to mirror the urgency in her voice. You have to understand, she continued, her fingers worrying the edge of a paper napkin until it began to shred. The children of divine light weren't just some fringe group holding prayer meetings in someone's basement. They owned everything, land, businesses, people's entire lives. When I finally escaped, I took something with me that they'll kill to get back. I set down my pen, studying her face. The afternoon light filtering through the rain-streaked glass cast shadows under her eyes, making the hollows of her cheeks appear deeper. What did you take? Sarah glanced around the cafe nervously. An elderly couple sat near the window, absorbed in their newspapers. The barista, a college student with purple hair, was focused on her phone. Still, Sarah lowered her voice to barely above a whisper. Records, financial documents, membership lists, but most importantly, she paused, swallowing hard, evidence of what they did to the children. Photos, medical records, incident reports that Elder Marcus kept locked in his private study. He documented everything, thinking it would protect him somehow, prove his methods were justified. My blood ran cold. What kind of methods? Discipline sessions that lasted for days, isolation in what they called purification chambers, metal shipping containers buried underground with no light, no sound, barely enough air to breathe. Children as young as 5 or 6 subjected to procedures they claimed would cleanse the devil's influence. Her voice cracked. I have names, dates, descriptions of things that would make your worst nightmares seem like fairy tales. The weight of what she was telling me settled like a stone in my chest. If what she claimed was true, she wasn't just a cult survivor. She was carrying evidence of systematic child abuse that could bring down an entire organization and send dozens of people to prison. Why come to me? I asked. Why not go straight to the FBI? Sarah's laugh was bitter. You think I haven't tried? Do you know how many law enforcement officials, judges, social workers, and politicians were members of the Divine Light? How many still are? The first detective I spoke to 3 years ago, his questions were too specific, too knowing. Within a week, I spotted the same black sedan following me for 6 days straight. She pulled out her phone, scrolling through what appeared to be a collection of photos. I've documented every suspicious encounter, every near miss, every time I've had to run. The images on her screen made my stomach clench. Photos taken from behind curtains and through car windows, showing the same faces appearing in different cities, different contexts. A man in a grey suit browsing magazines in an airport where Sarah had a layover. A woman with short blonde hair sitting 3 tables away at a restaurant in Phoenix. The same pair walking past a hotel in Denver where Sarah had stayed under an assumed name. They're patient, she said, swiping through more photos. They don't just chase, they coordinate. It's like they always know where I'm going before I get there. I studied the images more carefully. The quality was good enough to make out facial features, clothing details, license plate numbers. Either Sarah was an incredibly talented photographer with an elaborate fantasy, or she was telling the truth about being hunted. "How did you find me?" I asked. "Your series on the Riverside corruption scandal. You weren't afraid to name names, even when it meant going up against people with serious power. And you're independent. No corporate bosses, no political handlers. When someone tried to discredit you, you fought back with evidence and won." She leaned forward, her eyes intense. "I need someone who won't back down when things get dangerous, because they will get dangerous." The cafe's bell chimed as new customers entered. A man and woman, both dressed in dark clothing despite the warm weather. Sarah's entire body went rigid. Her hand shot across the table, gripping my wrist with surprising strength. "Don't turn around," she whispered, her face pale. "The woman in the navy jacket. I've seen her before, twice. Once in Portland last month, again in Sacramento 2 weeks ago." My heart rate spiked, but I forced myself to remain calm. Using the reflection in my phone screen, I caught a glimpse of a woman with auburn hair pulled into a tight bun, scanning the cafe with the systematic thoroughness of someone conducting surveillance. Sarah was already moving, gathering her jacket and bag with practiced efficiency. "We need to leave, now, through the back exit." "My car's in the alley," I whispered back. We walked toward the rear of the cafe, and I prayed we weren't already too late. The coffee shop's ambient noise faded into white static as Sarah's words hung between us. I studied her face, searching for any tell that might indicate deception, but found only the raw authenticity of trauma etched in every line around her eyes. "You said they're coming for you," I said, keeping my voice low. "What makes you so certain?" Sarah's fingers wrapped around her mug like it was an anchor. 3 days after I escaped, my neighbor's cat disappeared. Mrs. Henderson's tabby, Oscar. She'd had him for 8 years. She paused, swallowing hard. "They used to kill our pets when we misbehaved, said it taught us about consequences." A chill ran down my spine, but I pressed on. That could be a coincidence. The next day, someone left wildflowers on my doorstep, specifically Indian paintbrush and lupine. Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "Brother Marcus used to make us gather those exact flowers for the altar before punishment ceremonies. He called them redemption blooms." I pulled out my phone and opened the voice recorder app. "Would you mind if I recorded this? It might help if we need to involve law enforcement." Sarah's eyes darted to the device, then to my face. For a moment I thought she might bolt. Instead, she nodded slowly. "Maybe it's time someone else knew the truth." "Tell me about Brother Marcus," I said, hitting record. He wasn't the leader. That was Father Ezekiel. But Marcus was his enforcer. He had this way of making you feel like salvation and damnation were both held in his hands. She stared past me, lost in memory. He was maybe 40 when I was taken, tall and lean, with these pale blue eyes that seemed to look right through you. He had a scar across his left palm from some ritual cutting, and he'd trace it when he was thinking about your punishment. The description was vivid enough that I could almost see the man myself. What did these punishment ceremonies involve? Sarah's breathing quickened. Isolation was the mild version. They'd lock you in what they called the reflection chamber, a root cellar behind the main compound. No light, no sound, except for the recorded sermons playing on loop, sometimes for days. And the severe punishments? Public humiliation, beatings with a leather strap they claimed was blessed, and for the worst infractions. She stopped, her whole body shuddering. They would stage mock executions, make you dig your own grave, stand at the edge while they held the trial, pronounced your spiritual death. Then they'd fill in the hole while you watched, telling you that you'd just witnessed your own burial and now had to earn the right to exist again. I felt sick. How many people were in this group? It varied. Core members numbered maybe 30 adults, plus their children. But people came and went, Some died, others were sent away on missions we never heard about again. New recruits would arrive every few months. Where was the compound located? Northern Idaho, near the Canadian border, isolated, surrounded by dense forest. The nearest town was maybe 40 miles away. She met my eyes, but they had other properties too. Brother Marcus would disappear for weeks at a time, overseeing what Father Ezekiel called sister communities. The implications of that hit me like a physical blow. How many other communities? I don't know for certain, but I heard Marcus mention coordinates once, numbers that suggested locations across several states. Montana, Oregon, maybe Northern California. I leaned back, overwhelmed. What Sarah was describing wasn't just a single cult, but potentially an entire network of them. Have you contacted the FBI? That explained the cash payment, the reluctance to involve authorities. But you exist now. You've built a life. Under a false identity. I found Sarah Chen's wallet in a bus station restroom 3 years ago. She died in a car accident the week before, and somehow her ID ended up there. I've been living as her ever since. She looked directly into my eyes. So you see why I can't go to the police. They'd probably arrest me for identity theft before they'd listen to my story about the cult. The weight of her situation settled over me. She was trapped between the life she'd escaped and the law that couldn't protect her without destroying the fragile existence she'd built. There has to be another way, I said. Sarah's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and went pale. With trembling fingers, she turned it toward me. The message was from an unknown number, containing only a photo, wildflowers arranged in a perfect circle on what looked like her doorstep, taken from inside her apartment. "They're not just coming," she whispered. "They're already here." The coffee had gone cold hours ago, but neither of us seemed to notice. Sarah's voice had taken on a mechanical quality as she recounted the daily routines that had defined her existence within the compound's walls. 5 a.m. prayer circles, 6 hours of manual labor, scripture memorization until her throat was raw from reciting verses, punishment cells for those who showed even the slightest deviation from Prophet Matthias's teachings. "The children born inside never knew anything else existed," she whispered, her fingers tracing invisible patterns on the table between us. I was lucky, if you can call it that. I remembered fragments of the outside world. My mother's perfume, the sound of traffic, ice cream trucks playing their tinkling songs down suburban streets. I leaned forward, careful not to break the fragile thread of her narrative. How many children were there? Dozens, maybe more than 100 over the years. Her eyes grew distant. They called us the blessed generation, said we were chosen to inherit the new earth after the cleansing, but children who asked too many questions. They disappeared during the night migrations. The way she said it sent ice through my veins. Night migration? Sarah nodded slowly. Every few months, Matthias would declare that the Spirit had spoken to him. We'd pack everything in the darkness and move to a new location. Sometimes it was just across state lines. Other times we'd drive for days, but certain people never made it to the new camp. The troublemakers, the questioners, the sick. I thought about the missing persons reports I'd been researching since our first meeting. Dozens of families across the Midwest, with loved ones who had simply vanished without a trace. The dates Sarah was giving me aligned with several of those disappearances in a way that made my stomach clench. Where did they take them? I don't know. The admission seemed to physically pain her, but I heard whispers. The inner circle talked about purification rituals, about souls being released from corrupted flesh. Matthias taught that death was just another form of salvation for those too weak to achieve it through devotion. Outside, the afternoon light was beginning to fade, casting long shadows across my kitchen. Sarah glanced nervously toward the windows, a habit I'd noticed increasing as our conversations continued. She was always checking exits, always calculating escape routes. "Tell me about your escape," I said gently. "You mentioned it took years to plan." For the first time since she'd started talking, a ghost of a smile crossed her face. There was a woman named Helena. She'd been there almost as long as me, but she'd never fully broken, not completely. She kept a small part of herself hidden where they couldn't reach it. Sarah's voice grew stronger as she spoke about Helena, as if drawing strength from the memory. She worked in the communications center. They trusted her because she'd been there so long and she'd never caused trouble. But she was gathering information, learning about the outside world, building a map of safe places. What happened to her? The smile vanished. She didn't make it out with me. At the last minute, she said someone had to stay behind to cover our tracks, delete the files she'd accumulated, make sure the others had a chance. How many others escaped with you? 7. All young women. Helena said we had the best chance of blending into the outside world, of not being immediately recognizable. Sarah's hands began trembling again. We scattered as soon as we reached the highway. Different directions, different identities. Helena had prepared documentation for all of us. Fake IDs, birth certificates, even some cash. Do you know what happened to the others? Sarah shook her head, but there was something in her expression that suggested she knew more than she was saying. We agreed never to contact each other, for everyone's safety, but sometimes... She trailed off, staring at her hands. Sometimes what? The implication hung in the air between us like a toxic cloud. If the cult was systematically hunting down escapees, then Sarah's paranoia wasn't paranoia at all. It was survival instinct. That's why you think they're still looking for you. I know they are. Her voice was barely audible now, because 3 weeks ago I got a message. Just 2 words, "Come home." It was sent from an account that didn't exist when I tried to trace it back, but I recognized the phrasing, the way Matthias used to call the compound our eternal home. The room seemed to grow colder as she spoke, and I found myself glancing toward my own windows, suddenly aware of how exposed we were. The coffee had gone cold hours ago, but Sarah's hands still wrapped around the mug like it was an anchor. I watched her carefully, noting how her eyes darted to the window every few minutes, scanning the street below my apartment. The paranoia wasn't unfounded. I'd seen enough cases to know that cults didn't simply let valuable assets walk away. "Tell me about the hierarchy," I said, pulling out a fresh notebook. "Who was really in charge?" Sarah's jaw tightened. Everyone thought it was Father Gabriel. He gave the sermons, made the public pronouncements. But there was someone else, someone who stayed in the shadows. She paused, her breathing becoming shallow. I'd learned to recognize when trauma survivors were approaching dangerous territory in their memories. Too much pressure, and they'd shut down completely. "Take your time," I assured her. "We called him the Shepherd. I never saw his face clearly. He always wore this hood during the private ceremonies, but his voice..." She shuddered. It was like broken glass, and he had this scar on his left hand, shaped like a crescent moon. I only glimpsed it once when he was blessing the new children. New children? My stomach churned at the clinical way she said it, but I kept my expression neutral. How often did new children arrive? Every few months. Sometimes runaways, sometimes kids whose parents had joined willingly, the lucky ones. Her voice cracked. The unlucky ones were taken. The room fell silent except for the distant hum of traffic. I set down my pen and leaned forward. "Sarah, when you say taken..." A sharp knock at my door made us both freeze. Sarah's mug slipped from her hands, shattering against the hardwood floor. Coffee spread in dark rivulets between the planks. "Dr. Martinez?" A woman's voice called through the door. "I'm Detective Rosa Hernandez, LAPD. I need to speak with you." I glanced at Sarah, whose face had gone chalk white. She mouthed a single word, "them." Moving carefully to avoid the broken ceramic, I approached the door and peered through the peephole. A Latina woman in her 40s stood in the hallway, badge visible on her belt, but something felt off. Her stance was too rigid, too rehearsed. "Can you slide your badge under the door?" I called out. "Ma'am, this is an urgent matter regarding one of your patients. I really need to speak with you directly." Sarah had already moved away from the window, pressing herself against the far wall. Her survival instincts had been honed by 20 years of captivity, and right now they were screaming danger. "I'm going to need to see proper identification before I open this door," I insisted. The silence that followed stretched too long. When the woman spoke again, her tone had shifted, becoming colder. "Dr. Martinez, we know she's in there. Make this easy on yourself." My blood turned to ice. I grabbed my phone, fingers flying over the screen to dial 911, but the call wouldn't connect. No signal. In a downtown Los Angeles apartment, that was virtually impossible unless someone was using a signal jammer. Sarah had moved to my bedroom and returned with my emergency bag, the one I packed after my first death threat from a patient's abusive ex-husband. She was more prepared for this moment than I was. "The fire escape," she whispered, pointing toward the bedroom window. But before we could move, the front door exploded inward. Two figures in dark clothing rushed in, their faces obscured by ski masks. The woman who'd claimed to be Detective Hernandez was nowhere to be seen. "Run!" I shouted, pushing Sarah toward the bedroom as one of the intruders lunged for me. His hands closed around my arm, but 20 years of self-defense classes kicked in. I drove my elbow into his solar plexus and heard him grunt in pain. Sarah had already thrown open the bedroom window and was climbing onto the fire escape. "Go, go, go!" I yelled, following her through the window. The metal fire escape groaned under our combined weight as we clattered down the stairs. Behind us I could hear the intruders regrouping, their heavy footsteps echoing in the apartment. We hit the alley running, Sarah's hand gripping mine with desperate strength. She moved with the fluid grace of someone who'd spent years planning escape routes, leading me through a maze of narrow passages between buildings. The subway, she gasped as we emerged onto a busy street. Crowds, harder for them to follow. But as we approached the metro entrance, I spotted another figure in dark clothing scanning the crowd. Then another. They weren't just after Sarah. They'd planned for this contingency. "How many of them are there?" I whispered. Sarah's eyes were wild with terror as she surveyed our surroundings. "Enough," she said simply. "They've found me, Dr. Martinez, and now they know you're helping me." Her grip on my hand tightened. "I'm sorry. I've made you a target too." The safe house felt different in the pre-dawn darkness. Sarah had barely slept, and I'd spent most of the night reviewing her file, cross-referencing names and locations she'd mentioned. Detective Chen had sent over additional intelligence reports, and what I found made my blood run cold. 3 women matching Sarah's description had disappeared from towns within a 100-mile radius over the past 18 months, all in their 20s, all with dark hair and slight builds, all vanished without a trace. Sarah emerged from the bedroom looking hollow-eyed, clutching a cup of coffee like it was her lifeline. "You found something," she said, reading my expression immediately. "Sit down," I said gently, closing the laptop. "We need to talk about why you think they're coming for you specifically." She settled into the chair across from me, that familiar tremor returning to her hands. "I told you yesterday. I know things about them, about what they did. It's more than that, isn't it?" I leaned forward. "Sarah, I need you to tell me about the other women, the ones who tried to leave before you." Her face went ashen. The coffee cup slipped from her fingers, shattering against the floor. Neither of us moved to clean it up. "How do you know about them?" she whispered. "Because they're still disappearing. Women who look like you. And I think you know why." Sarah began rocking slightly, a self-soothing motion I recognized from trauma survivors. "There were 7 of us," she said finally. 7 who Father Matthias called his chosen daughters. We were special to him. The way she said special made my stomach turn. We lived in a separate building from the other children. We had different rules, different duties. She couldn't look at me. When I escaped, I wasn't the first to try. Rebecca tried when she was 19. They brought her back after 3 days. What happened to her? She disappeared a week later. They told everyone she'd been called to serve God in a different way. But I saw them loading something into the van that night. Something wrapped in sheets. My hands clenched involuntarily. How many others tried to leave? 3 more, over the years. They all disappeared the same way. Sarah's voice was barely audible now. "The thing is, I wasn't supposed to escape. Father Matthias had special plans for me. I was meant to be his his successor's bride, to start the next generation. The pieces were clicking into place with horrifying clarity. "You're not just a witness, Sarah. You're unfinished business." She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I was supposed to marry his son, David, when I turned 25. I escaped 6 months before the ceremony. They've been looking for me ever since, and now—" She gestured helplessly. "Now they're taking women who look like me. I think they're trying to replace me. Or they're using them as bait," I said grimly. "Making you feel responsible so you'll come back." My phone buzzed. Chen's name flashed on the screen. "We've got a problem," he said without preamble. "Another woman's gone missing. Emma Rodriguez, 24, from Millbrook. Disappeared last night from the parking lot of her apartment complex." I closed my eyes. Millbrook was less than 30 miles from here. "Any witnesses?" Security camera caught a white van leaving the scene around the time she would have gotten home from work. License plate was obscured, but here's the thing. Her neighbor said she'd been getting strange calls for the past week. Someone claiming to have information about her missing sister. "She doesn't have a missing sister," I said, already knowing the answer. "No family at all. Parents died in a car accident when she was 18. She was completely alone, just like they preferred their victims." I looked at Sarah, who was watching me with growing dread. "There's something else," Chen continued. "We found a note in her apartment. Just 2 words, 'Come home.' Chen, we need to move her, now." "Already on it. I've got a team en route to your location. But listen, we intercepted some chatter on police frequencies. Someone's been monitoring law enforcement communications in the area. These people are more organized than we initially thought." "How long do we have?" 20 minutes, maybe less." I hung up and grabbed Sarah's shoulders. "We're leaving. Right now. Take only what you absolutely need." She was already moving toward the bedroom when she stopped and turned back to me. "There's something else I haven't told you, about why they want me specifically. Tell me in the car." "No, you need to know this now." Her voice carried a new urgency. "I'm not just Father Matthias's chosen successor. I'm his daughter." The room seemed to tilt. Outside, I heard the distant sound of vehicles approaching. We were out of time. The safe house felt smaller with each passing hour, its beige walls closing in like the cells Sarah had described from her childhood. I watched her pace between the kitchenette and the single window, her movements sharp and restless. The federal agents had been gone for 3 hours, leaving us with nothing but promises of increased surveillance and a phone number that went straight to voicemail. "They don't understand," Sarah muttered, pulling the curtain aside for the dozenth time. "The shepherds don't announce themselves. They don't knock." I set down my lukewarm coffee and joined her at the window. The parking lot stretched empty except for a maintenance truck and Mrs. Henderson from Unit 12 walking her ancient poodle. Everything looked normal, but Sarah's tension was infectious. "Tell me about the other escapees," I said, hoping to redirect her spiraling anxiety. "The ones who made it out before you." Her hand dropped from the curtain. "There weren't many, maybe 6 or 7 over the years. The first was Marcus. He was 17 when he climbed the fence during a supply run. They found him 3 days later." "Found him how?" "Hanging from a tree 2 miles from the compound. Father Matthias told us he'd taken his own life. Couldn't handle the corruption of the outside world." She turned away from the window. I believed it then. Now I know better. The weight of her words settled between us. I'd spent weeks listening to Sarah's story, but each revelation peeled back another layer of horror. "What about the others?" "Car accidents, drug overdoses. One girl supposedly threw herself off a bridge in Portland." Sarah's voice carried a bitter edge. Amazing how many of us couldn't cope with freedom. I pulled out my notebook, scanning the names she'd given me over our sessions. 7 people, all dead within months of leaving the shepherds. The statistical probability was astronomical. "Sarah, this is evidence of murder. Multiple murders." "Evidence?" She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Show me the bodies. Show me the witnesses. The shepherds are careful. They've had decades to perfect their methods." My phone buzzed. Unknown number. Sarah's eyes fixed on the screen as I hesitated, then answered. "Dr. Hayes?" The voice was unfamiliar, male, with a slight accent I couldn't place. Sarah grabbed my wrist, her nails digging into skin. "Who is this?" "A friend. You've been asking questions about people who don't appreciate questions. Perhaps we should meet." "I don't think—" "The coffee shop on 5th and Main. 1 hour. Come alone. And Dr. Hayes, bring your patient. She has something that belongs to us." The line went dead. Sarah had gone white, her breathing shallow and rapid. "They found us," she whispered. "How did they find us?" I was already moving, grabbing our coats and the bag I'd kept packed since this nightmare began. "We're not going to that meeting. We're calling Agent Morrison." Sarah caught my arm. "You don't understand. If we run now, if we hide, they'll never stop hunting. They have resources you can't imagine. Money, connections, people in places you'd never suspect. So, what are you suggesting?" She met my eyes, and for the first time since I'd known her, I saw something other than fear there. Determination, maybe, or desperation. "We go to the meeting, but we don't go alone." 20 minutes later, we sat in my car 3 blocks from the coffee shop, waiting for Agent Morrison and his team to get into position. The plan was simple. Sarah and I would enter through the front while federal agents surrounded the building. Morrison's voice crackled through the earpiece they'd given me. "Remember, Dr. Hayes, we need them to talk. Find out what they want, how they found you, what this thing is that Sarah supposedly has." I glanced at Sarah in the passenger seat. She'd barely spoken since making the decision to face her captors. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap, but the trembling had stopped. "What do they think you have?" I asked. "The truth," she said quietly. "Names, locations, financial records. Father Matthias kept detailed documentation of everything, donations, property purchases, births and deaths. He believed God would judge him based on his record-keeping. You memorized all of it? 20 years is a long time to observe and remember. I know where they bank their money, who their lawyers are, which politicians they've bought." She turned to look at me. "I'm not just a victim, Dr. Hayes. I'm their greatest threat," Morrison's voice interrupted. "We're in position. You're clear to approach." Sarah reached for the door handle, then paused. "Whatever happens in there, don't trust anyone except me. The Shepherds have had decades to place their people everywhere. Even federal agents aren't immune to corruption." As we walked toward the coffee shop, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were walking into a trap that had been 20 years in the making. The rain hammered against the safe-house windows as Sarah paced the small living room, her bare feet silent on the worn carpet. 3 days had passed since our meeting at the diner, and the weight of her revelations still pressed against my chest like a physical thing. I watched her from the kitchen table, noting how she avoided the windows even though Marcus had assured us the blinds were thick enough to obscure any view from outside. "They know I'm talking," she said suddenly, breaking the silence that had stretched between us for the better part of an hour. "I can feel it." Marcus looked up from his laptop, fingers pausing over the keyboard. "What makes you say that?" Sarah stopped pacing and turned toward us, her dark hair falling across her face. "You wouldn't understand. When you've lived with them for 20 years, you develop a sixth sense. They taught us to feel each other's thoughts, to sense when the family was in danger." She laughed bitterly. Funny how those same skills work against them now. I set down my coffee cup, the ceramic clicking against the saucer. "Sarah, we need more concrete information. The location of the compound, names of the leadership, anything that could help us find them before they find you. You still don't get it." Her voice carried an edge of frustration. "This isn't just some backwoods cult hiding in the mountains. They have people everywhere. Government offices, police departments, hospitals. How do you think they stayed hidden for so long?" Marcus closed his laptop and leaned forward. "Then give us something to work with. You mentioned Brother Thomas was recruiting new families. Where? How?" Sarah moved to the window, her fingers barely parting the blinds to peer outside. "Foster care systems, mostly. Broken families, kids who won't be missed right away. Thomas had a gift for identifying vulnerability. She let the blinds fall back into place. There was this girl, Emma, couldn't have been more than 12 when they brought her in. Her parents had died in a car accident, and she'd been bouncing between foster homes for months. When was this? I asked, pulling out my notebook. 2 years ago, maybe 3. Time blurs together in that place. Sarah wrapped her arms around herself. Thomas performed what he called a cleansing ceremony for her, took away her old name, her memories of the outside world. By the end of the first month, she was calling him father and speaking in tongues during the prayer circles. The room fell quiet except for the rain and the scratch of my pen against paper. I'd filled 3 notebooks since our first meeting, documenting every detail Sarah could remember. Names, faces, rituals, the layout of buildings she'd only seen glimpses of during her rare ventures outside the dormitory. "There's something else," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Something I haven't told you." Marcus and I exchanged glances. "What is it?" She turned away from the window and walked to the couch, sinking into the cushions as if the weight of her words was already pressing her down. The night I escaped wasn't random. I had help. Help from whom? Brother David, one of Thomas's inner circle. Sarah's hands began to tremble again, and I noticed she'd started that unconscious scratching at her wrists. He came to my room after midnight prayers and told me there was a car waiting at the north gate. Said I had 10 minutes. "Why would he do that?" Marcus asked. "Because he knew what Thomas was planning for me." Sarah's voice cracked. "My 20th anniversary was coming up, 20 years since they took me from my parents' car after the accident. Thomas wanted to make me his 4th wife." The words hung in the air like a physical presence. I felt my stomach clench as the implications settled in. "David said something else before he left," Sarah continued. "He said Thomas was planning something big. A final gathering, he called it. All the compounds coming together in one place." "How many compounds are there?" Marcus asked. "I don't know exactly, but I heard Thomas talking once about the 7 sisters, 7 locations across the country, each with maybe 50 to 100 people. I did the math quickly in my head. Hundreds of people, many of them likely children taken from broken homes or born into the cult. The scope of it was staggering. "Sarah," I said carefully, "where is Brother David now?" She looked up at me, and I saw something new in her eyes. Not just fear anymore, but a glimmer of hope mixed with desperate determination. "That's what I've been trying to tell you," she said. "He's been leaving me messages, little signs that only someone from inside would know. A flower arrangement at the grocery store yesterday, a specific pattern of chalk marks on the sidewalk outside the library. What kind of messages? He wants to meet, and he says he has information about the final gathering." Sarah leaned forward, her intensity filling the small room. "He wants to help me stop them." The safe house felt like a tomb at 3 in the morning. I'd positioned myself by the window, watching shadows that might or might not have been moving between the trees. Sarah had finally fallen asleep on the couch, her breathing shallow but steady. Detective Morrison sat across from me, nursing his 4th cup of coffee. "Tell me about the compound layout again," I whispered, not wanting to wake Sarah. Morrison pulled out the sketches Sarah had drawn earlier. Her artistic training, even interrupted by captivity, had served her well. The drawings were precise, detailed, almost architectural in their accuracy. "Main building here," he pointed. 23 rooms, including the ceremonial chamber where they held the rituals. Dormitories for the children here and here. The shepherd's quarters in this wing, completely separate from everyone else. I studied the lines she'd drawn with such careful attention to detail. "What about exits?" 3 main ones. Front entrance, service door by the kitchens, and an emergency exit from the ceremonial chamber. But Sarah mentioned something else, a tunnel system, underground. Started as a root cellar, but the shepherd expanded it over the years. She thinks it connects to at least 2 buildings, maybe more, could lead anywhere within a half-mile radius. The implications made my stomach turn. They could be anywhere, watching, waiting. The cult had spent decades perfecting their isolation, their control. They wouldn't give up one of their own easily. Morrison's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, his expression darkening. What is it? Crime scene team found something at Sarah's apartment. He scrolled through the message. They left more than just those symbols on her walls. He showed me the photo. My blood went cold. Carved into Sarah's kitchen table were detailed instructions, coordinates, times, meeting locations. But it wasn't random vandalism. It was a message, a code that Sarah would understand. They want her to come home, I realized. It gets worse. Those coordinates, they're not for the original compound. This is somewhere new. I looked over at Sarah's sleeping form. Even in rest, her face carried the weight of her trauma. Her fingers clutched the throw pillow like a lifeline. We need to wake her. Morrison shook his head. Let her sleep. She'll need her strength for what's coming, which is... I've been thinking about this all night. The cult's playbook is predictable. Isolation, control, psychological manipulation. But they've made a tactical error. They've exposed themselves by coming after her. I wasn't following his logic. How is that an error? They know where she lives, where she works. They're hunting her. Exactly. For 20 years, they stayed hidden. No one knew they existed, no law enforcement presence, no outside interference. But now they're operating in our territory, leaving evidence, taking risks. They're desperate. Morrison pulled up another file on his phone, missing persons reports dating back months. Look at this pattern. 3 young women, all disappeared within 50 miles of the original compound site. All between 18 and 25. All from broken homes or unstable situations. They're recruiting. More than that, they're rebuilding. The shepherd is getting older. Sarah mentioned he was already in his 60s when she escaped. Cults like this don't survive leadership transitions well unless they're carefully planned. The pieces were falling into place with horrifying clarity. Sarah isn't just a loose end they want to tie up. She's a symbol. If word gets out that someone successfully escaped and started a new life, other members might get ideas about freedom. Can't have that. A floorboard creaked behind us. We turned to find Sarah standing in the doorway, fully alert despite having been asleep moments before. A survival skill learned from years of needing to wake instantly. They're not just coming for me, she said quietly. You're right about the rebuilding, but you're missing something important. She moved toward us, her bare feet silent on the hardwood floor. The shepherd doesn't just want me back to maintain control. He needs me for something specific. Her voice carried a weight I hadn't heard before. The tunnels Detective Morrison mentioned? I didn't just live above them, I helped design them. Morrison and I exchanged glances. Sarah, what aren't you telling us? She sat down heavily, pulling her knees to her chest. The compound wasn't just a place of worship, it was a fortress. And they've been expanding it for decades, using child labor, using me. I know every entrance, every exit, every hiding place. She met my eyes directly. I'm not just a runaway they want back, I'm their architect. And if they're building something new, they need the blueprints, Morrison finished. Sarah nodded. Everything's in my head. 20 years of construction, modifications, secret passages. They can't replicate it without me. Outside, a car engine started in the distance. We all froze, listening as the sound faded into the night. But the damage was done. We were no longer hunting shadows. The shadows were hunting us. The fluorescent lights in the police station flickered as Detective Sarah Chen spread the photographs across the metal table. Each image showed the same haunting symbol, a twisted tree with 7 branches, carved into wooden posts, spray-painted on abandoned buildings, etched into the sides of delivery trucks. The pattern had emerged over the past 72 hours, appearing throughout the city like a spreading infection. They're marking territory, Maya whispered, her finger hovering over one of the photos. The eternal grove always did this before a harvest. I watched her face pale as she studied the images. Since our interview 3 days ago, Maya had agreed to work with the police, but the cost was written in the deepening shadows under her eyes. and the way she startled at every sudden sound. Harvest? Detective Chen's pen was poised over her notepad. You've mentioned this term before. Maya's hands clenched in her lap. It's what they called their recruitment drives. They'd target vulnerable people, runaways, addicts, people who'd lost everything, but sometimes, she paused, swallowing hard, sometimes they took people who weren't vulnerable at all, people who had families, children. The room fell silent, except for the hum of the air conditioning. I'd been documenting cult activities for years, but Maya's story continued to reveal new depths of horror. There's something else, Chen said, sliding another photograph across the table. We found this at the scene of yesterday's break-in downtown. The image showed a piece of paper, yellowed with age, covered in the same spidery handwriting I'd seen in Maya's stolen journal. But this wasn't from her diary. The words were different, more formal, like a legal document. Maya's breath caught. That's a binding contract. They make everyone sign them when they reach 16. Her voice dropped to barely a whisper. It says you pledge your life, your future children, your very soul to the community, forever. But surely these wouldn't hold up in any court, I said. You don't understand. Maya's eyes were wide with remembered terror. They don't care about courts. To them, these contracts are sacred, unbreakable, and according to their twisted theology, anyone who breaks them... She couldn't finish the sentence. Detective Chen leaned forward. Maya, we need you to tell us everything about their structure. Leadership, locations, how they operate. We've had reports of missing persons that match their profile, and with these symbols appearing... You're not listening, Maya interrupted, her voice rising. You can't fight them with normal police work. They're not just a cult, they're a shadow society. They have people everywhere. Police, social services, hospitals. How do you think they stayed hidden for so long? The implication hung in the air like poison gas. Chen's face hardened. Are you suggesting there are cult members in law enforcement? I'm not suggesting anything. I'm telling you what I lived through for 20 years. Maya stood abruptly, pacing to the small window. Brother Marcus used to brag about their reach. He said the roots of the eternal grove stretched into every institution that mattered. I thought about the break-in at my apartment, how professional it had seemed, how they'd known exactly where to look for Maya's journal, as if they'd been watching us from the beginning. There's more, Chen said reluctantly. She pulled out a manila folder. We ran the prints from your apartment break-in through the system. No matches in the criminal database, but... She hesitated. One of our tech analysts recognized the methodology, said it matched techniques used in federal operations. The words hit like ice water. Maya turned from the window, her face ashen. Federal operations? Could be ex-military, ex-intelligence, people with training. Chen's voice was carefully neutral, but I could see the concern in her eyes. The question is, how does a religious cult recruit people with those kinds of skills? Maya's laugh was bitter and short. You still think this is about religion? The Eternal Grove stopped being about faith a long time ago. It's about power now, control. They've been building something for decades, and people like me, people who escaped, we're loose ends. She moved back to the table, pressing her palms against the metal surface. The symbols aren't just marking territory, they're a countdown. Each one appears in a specific sequence, following patterns Brother Marcus taught us as children. 7 branches on the tree, 7 phases of the harvest. Chen looked down at the photographs, counting. How many phases are we into? Maya's voice was barely audible. This is phase 5? The silence that followed was deafening. Outside, the city continued its oblivious rhythm, people going about their daily lives unaware that something ancient and malevolent was stirring in the shadows. 7 phases, and they were already 5 deep into whatever the Eternal Grove had planned. I watched Maya's reflection in the window glass and saw not just a survivor, but a woman preparing for war. The safe house felt smaller than it had an hour ago, the walls pressing closer as Maya paced between the kitchen counter and the window. Detective Rodriguez had left 20 minutes earlier, promising to return with news about the surveillance footage from the hospital. but her absence only amplified the tension crackling through the air. Sarah sat hunched over my laptop, her fingers moving with surprising speed across the keyboard. She'd asked to search for something, what she hadn't said, and I'd given her access despite every journalistic instinct screaming at me to ask questions. The pale glow from the screen cast harsh shadows under her eyes, making her look even more fragile than usual. "They always said technology was the devil's tool," she murmured, not looking up from the screen. "But Brother Matthias, he had computers in his private office. Sometimes I had to clean in there, and I could see him watching things, news reports, social media. He knew everything happening in the outside world while we lived like it was still 1950. Maya stopped pacing. "What are you looking for, Sarah?" "Names." Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper. "The children who were born in the compound after I arrived. I need to know if any of them—" She trailed off, her hand hovering over the trackpad. I moved closer, careful not to startle her. "If any of them what?" "If any of them made it out." The words came out broken, each syllable carrying the weight of 20 years of guilt. "When I escaped, I left behind 17 children. Some were teenagers by then, but others—" She closed her eyes. "Others were barely walking." The silence stretched between us, heavy with implications I wasn't sure I was ready to confront. Sarah had mentioned the children before, but always in abstract terms, as if speaking about them too specifically might somehow put them in greater danger. "Sarah," Maya said gently, "you couldn't have taken them with you. You know that, right?" "Do I?" Sarah's eyes snapped open, fierce and bright with unshed tears. "Because Brother Matthias made sure to tell me exactly what would happen to them if I ever left. How my selfishness would bring God's wrath down on the innocent." She turned back to the laptop screen. "But maybe if I can find evidence that some of them escaped after me, maybe if I can prove that my leaving didn't—" The laptop screen flickered, and suddenly we were looking at a missing persons database. Row after row of photographs filled the monitor, faces of children and teenagers who had vanished without a trace. Sarah's breathing became shallow as she scrolled through them. "There," she whispered, pointing to a grainy photograph of a teenage girl with dark hair and serious eyes. "That's Emma. She would be 19 now." Her finger moved to another image. "And David. He'd be 17. I leaned in closer, studying the photos. Both children had been reported missing from different states, months apart, with no obvious connection between their disappearances. But Sarah saw something I didn't, some thread that tied these cases together. "They're not missing," she said, her voice growing stronger. "They're not dead. They're recruiting." Maya joined us at the laptop. "What do you mean?" "The Covenant doesn't just keep the children born in the compound. They take others. Runaways, kids from broken homes, anyone vulnerable enough to believe their promises of family and purpose." Sarah clicked to another page, this one showing a map with red pins scattered across several states. "Look at the pattern. The disappearances cluster around rural areas, places where the Covenant has established safe houses." My stomach clenched as the implications sank in. "You're saying they're building a network?" "I'm saying they never stop building a network." Sarah's hands had stopped trembling, replaced by a grim determination that transformed her entire demeanor. Brother Matthias always talked about the Great Expansion, the time when the Covenant would spread across the country like wildfire. We thought it was just another one of his prophecies, but what if it wasn't? What if everything that happened at the compound was just the beginning? A car door slammed outside, and we all froze. Maya moved to the window, peering through the blinds with practiced caution. "It's Rodriguez," she said, but her voice carried a note of confusion. "She's not alone." Through the thin curtains, I could see Detective Rodriguez walking toward the front door, but her usual confident stride seemed forced, mechanical. Behind her, partially obscured by the shadows of the evening, was a figure in dark clothing. Sarah's face went white. "We need to leave. Now." "Sarah, it's just—" I started to say, but she was already moving, grabbing the laptop and shoving it into my hands. "They found us," she whispered. "I don't know how, but they found us." The knock on the door came 3 times, evenly spaced, followed by Rodriguez's voice calling out a greeting. But something in the rhythm of those knocks, something in the careful neutrality of her tone, made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Sarah was already heading toward the back door, and for the first time since I'd met her, she wasn't running from her past. She was running toward something far worse. The silence stretched between us like a taut wire, ready to snap. Sarah's confession about the ritual chamber hung in the air, heavy with implications I wasn't sure I wanted to fully comprehend. Outside, the first drops of rain began pattering against the safe-house windows, each sound making her flinch. "There's something else," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the growing storm. "Something I haven't told you about Marcus." My pen hovered over my notepad. Every revelation seemed to peel back another layer of horror, like unwrapping a gift you never wanted to receive. What about him? He wasn't just the leader's son. He was... She struggled with the words, her fingers twisting the fabric of her sleeves. He was my handler, my keeper, from the time I was 7 until I escaped. The weight of that statement settled in my chest like a stone. 20 years. She'd been under this man's control for 20 years, and now he was out there hunting her down. The compound had rules, Sarah continued, her eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond the wall. Strict hierarchies. Children belonged to specific handlers who were responsible for their development. Marcus chose me personally when I turned 7, said I had the right temperament for special training. I felt sick. Special training? Preparation for the rituals, but also surveillance. They trained some of us to watch the others, to report any signs of rebellion or doubt. They called us the shepherd's eyes. Her laugh was bitter and hollow. We were children spying on children, ensuring no one ever questioned the prophet's word. The rain was coming down harder now, drumming against the roof with increasing intensity. Agent Rodriguez appeared in the doorway, checking on us with his eyes while keeping his hand near his weapon. The tension in the house had been building all day, everyone sensing that something was about to break. Marcus was different from the other handlers, Sarah said. Smarter, more patient. He never used physical violence like the others did. Instead, he used psychological manipulation so subtle that for years I actually believed he cared about me, that he was protecting me from worse fates. Stockholm Syndrome, I murmured. Exactly, but it was more than that. He was grooming me for something specific. When I turned 16, the prophet announced that I was to be Marcus's bride, part of a sacred ceremony that would bind our souls for eternity. She shuddered. That's when I first started planning my escape. A sharp crack of thunder made us both jump. The lights flickered momentarily, and I saw Rodriguez speaking urgently into his radio. Something was wrong. The other agents were moving with increased purpose, checking windows and doors. "Sarah, we need to speed this up," I said, sensing the shift in atmosphere. "Tell me about the night you escaped." I was 19. It took me 3 years to plan because I knew I'd only get one chance. The compound was in the mountains of Montana, completely isolated. But I'd been watching the patrol patterns, memorizing the guard rotations. Marcus had taught me to be observant, never realizing I was observing him too. Her voice was getting stronger, more urgent, as if she sensed the same tension I did. There was a supply run scheduled for a Tuesday night in March. One of the trucks would be leaving empty, heading back to town for provisions. I hid in the cargo area for 6 hours before they loaded the truck, barely breathing, terrified someone would find me. Rodriguez was at my shoulder now, his voice low. "We need to move. There's been a breach in the perimeter." My blood ran cold. "How close?" "Close enough. We're relocating now." Sarah's face went white. "They found me. I knew they would." She was already standing, moving toward the small bag she'd kept packed since arriving. Marcus always said he could track me anywhere, that the prophet's reach was infinite. I grabbed my recorder and notes, my hands shaking almost as much as hers. "The ritual chamber you mentioned, where was it located? This could be important for the FBI to know." "Beneath the main building. Marcus called it the Heart of Truth. That's where they performed the binding ceremonies, the punishments, She couldn't finish the sentence as agents swarmed around us, preparing for immediate evacuation. Rodriguez was barking orders into his radio while another agent checked the rear exit. The rain had become a torrential downpour, which would provide cover but also make escape more treacherous. "Sarah," I said, grabbing her arm gently, "whatever happens next, you're not going back there. You understand me? We're going to get through this." She nodded, but her eyes held that same haunted look I'd seen when she first sat across from me days ago. "You don't understand," she whispered as we moved toward the back door. "Marcus isn't just trying to bring me back to the compound. The prophet is dead. Marcus is building something new, something worse, and he needs me to complete it." The lights went out completely, plunging us into darkness just as the first window exploded inward. The safe house felt more like a tomb with each passing hour. Sarah hadn't spoken since Marcus arrived with the photographs, and the silence stretched between us like a wire pulled taut. Outside, rain drummed against the bulletproof windows, while two federal agents maintained their vigil in the shadows of the yard. "They know where we are," Sarah finally whispered, her voice barely audible above the storm. "They always know." I set down my untouched coffee and studied her face. The color had drained from her cheeks, leaving behind the same hollow expression I'd seen when she first walked into my office 3 weeks ago. But now I understood the source of that haunted look. 20 years of conditioning doesn't disappear overnight. "The tracking device Marcus found was sophisticated," I said carefully. "But it's gone now. They can't—" "You don't understand." Sarah's laugh was bitter, broken. The device was just backup. They taught us from childhood that Father sees everything, knows everything. Even if they never found me, I'd always be watching for them, always afraid. That's the real prison." Marcus looked up from his laptop where he'd been analyzing the cult's financial records. "The compound in Oregon was just one location. I've traced money transfers to properties in 4 other states: Montana, Utah, New Mexico, and Wyoming. This is bigger than we thought." The weight of his words settled over me like lead. We weren't dealing with a small, isolated group. This was a network, possibly spanning decades, with resources and reach that explained how they'd managed to operate undetected for so long. "The children," Sarah said suddenly, gripping the edge of the table. "In those photographs Marcus showed us. I recognized some of them. They were just babies when I left, but I remember their faces." Her breath came in short gasps. Emma was only 3. Tommy wasn't even walking yet. "Sarah, you need to focus on breathing." I moved to sit beside her, recognizing the signs of an incoming panic attack. "We're going to find them. They'll be 15 now. 14. Sarah's eyes had gone glassy, distant. "If they're even still alive. Some of the older children, when they questioned Father's teachings or tried to leave." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Marcus closed his laptop with a sharp click. "I've been in contact with Agent Rodriguez. They're coordinating raids on all the properties simultaneously. But Sarah's right. This group has been planning for contingencies for decades. By the time federal agents arrive, these places might be empty." The lights flickered, and all 3 of us froze. Outside, I could hear one of the agents speaking into his radio, his voice urgent but indistinct through the rain. Then the power went out entirely, plunging us into darkness save for the glow of Marcus's laptop screen. "They're here," Sarah breathed. I fumbled for my phone's flashlight, but Marcus was already moving, pulling a gun from beneath his jacket. I hadn't even known he was armed. The federal agent's voice outside had gone silent. "Back room now," Marcus commanded, but Sarah was shaking her head violently. No, no. You don't understand what they're capable of. They don't just kill, they take. They'll make me watch while they—" She was hyperventilating now, 20 years of suppressed trauma flooding back at once. A sound echoed through the house, soft, rhythmic, footsteps on the front porch. Then came something that made my blood freeze. Humming. A children's lullaby, sweet and innocent, drifting through the walls. "The back exit," Marcus whispered, gesturing toward the kitchen. "There's a car waiting 2 blocks east." But as we moved through the darkness, Sarah suddenly stopped. The journal, she gasped. I left Father's journal upstairs. Without it, there's no proof of what they did to us. No way to save the others. The humming was getting closer, now accompanied by the soft creak of the front door opening. How had they gotten past the federal agents so easily? Unless one of them is on the inside, I realized, the pieces clicking together with horrifying clarity. Someone in law enforcement. Marcus's face was grim in the laptop's blue glow. Rodriguez was the only one who knew about all the raid locations. If he warned them, the humming stopped abruptly. In the sudden silence, I could hear my own heartbeat, Sarah's ragged breathing, and something else, whispered voices, multiple people moving through the house with practiced stealth. Sarah straightened suddenly, and I saw something shift in her expression. The terror was still there, but underneath it was a steel I hadn't seen before. "I'm not running anymore," she said quietly. "I'm not that frightened child. And I'm not leaving those kids to suffer what I suffered." Before either Marcus or I could stop her, she was moving toward the front of the house, toward the voices, toward 20 years of nightmares made flesh. The real confrontation was about to begin. The warehouse felt different in the pre-dawn darkness. Every shadow seemed to pulse with malevolent life, and the silence carried an electric tension that made my skin crawl. Sarah paced near the windows, her movements sharp and restless, while Detective Morrison coordinated with the tactical team through his earpiece. "They should have been here by now," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible above the distant hum of traffic. "Father Matthias is never late. Something's wrong." I checked my phone for the 100th time. 4:47 a.m. We'd been waiting for over an hour, positioned throughout the building like pieces on a chessboard. The weight of the recording device in my pocket felt heavier with each passing minute. Morrison's radio crackled softly. "Unit 3, anything on the perimeter?" "Negative. No movement detected." Sarah suddenly froze, her head tilted as if listening to something beyond our hearing. "They're not coming," she said, turning to face us with wide, terrified eyes. "They know. They always know." Before Morrison could respond, the lights went out. Emergency lighting kicked in a second later, bathing everything in an eerie red glow. Morrison was already moving, speaking rapidly into his radio while drawing his weapon. "All units, we have a power situation. Maintain positions," and the radio died with a burst of static. "They're here," Sarah breathed. "Different plan, same result. They adapt, they survive. That's how they've lasted so long." A sound echoed through the building, not quite footsteps, but a rhythmic tapping that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Sarah's face went chalk white. "The children," she whispered. "They use the children as scouts. They're small, quiet. They map the building before the others move in." Morrison gestured for silence, but I could see the uncertainty in his eyes. This wasn't going according to plan. None of us had anticipated this level of tactical awareness from a religious cult. The tapping stopped. In the sudden silence, Sarah grabbed my arm. "We need to leave, now." "The basement. There's a maintenance tunnel that leads to the next building. I saw it when we were setting up." Morrison shook his head. "We stick to the plan. My team—" "Your team is compromised," Sarah hissed. "You don't understand what you're dealing with. These aren't delusional fanatics. Father Matthias was military before he found religion. Half his inner circle are former special forces. They don't just preach about holy war, they know how to fight one." As if summoned by her words, a new sound drifted through the air. Singing. Low, haunting voices raised in perfect harmony, the words indistinct but unmistakably threatening. The melody seemed to wrap around us, coming from every direction at once. "Psychological warfare," Morrison muttered, but his hand shook slightly as he adjusted his grip on his weapon. The singing grew louder, and I realized there were children's voices woven into the adult chorus. The sound was beautiful and horrible, innocent yet corrupted. Sarah was trembling now, her breathing rapid and shallow. "It's the cleansing song," she whispered. "They sing it before they purify the unfaithful." A door somewhere in the building opened with a soft click, then another. The singing continued, but now it was punctuated by the whisper of careful footsteps. Morrison tried his radio again. Nothing but dead air. How many? I asked Sarah. Depends on how important they consider this. Could be 6, could be 60. They have safe houses throughout the city, and every member would die before betraying the family. The footsteps were closer now, moving with military precision. Morrison made hand signals toward the other positions, but I wondered if his team was even still there. The cult had demonstrated an unsettling ability to anticipate our moves. Sarah was backing toward the rear of the warehouse, her eyes fixed on a maintenance door barely visible in the red emergency lighting. The tunnel, she mouthed silently. But as we moved, a figure stepped out of the shadows near the door. Tall, gaunt, wearing the simple brown robes I'd come to associate with nightmare scenarios. His face was serene, almost kind, but his eyes held the flat emptiness of absolute conviction. "Sarah," he said, his voice carrying despite the continued singing. "Daughter, it's time to come home." Sarah made a sound like a wounded animal. "Brother Thomas, I thought you were dead." "Death is just another kind of sleep," he replied, taking a step closer. "And you've been sleeping for 3 years now. Father Matthias has been patient, but patience has its limits." More figures emerged from the shadows, men, women, even teenagers, all wearing the same expression of serene certainty. They formed a loose circle, closing off our escape routes with practiced efficiency. Morrison raised his weapon, but Brother Thomas smiled sadly. "Detective Morrison, your team is safe, merely sleeping. We prefer not to harm those who aren't truly involved in our family matters." The singing reached a crescendo, then stopped abruptly. In the sudden silence, I could hear Sarah's ragged breathing and the distant sound of sirens, too far away to matter. "Now then," Brother Thomas continued, his gaze settling on me, "let's discuss what happens next." The warehouse stood like a tomb against the industrial skyline, its broken windows staring down at us like dead eyes. Sarah's breathing had become shallow, almost panicked, as we approached the rusted entrance where she'd spent the last 7 years of her captivity. "They moved us here when I turned 16, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind whistling through the metal framework. "Said it was time for me to take on greater responsibilities." Detective Morrison flanked her other side, his hand resting on his service weapon. The tactical team had already swept the perimeter, but the building felt alive with malevolent energy. Every shadow could hide a member of the Order of Eternal Light. Every sound could signal our discovery. Inside, the air hung thick with the smell of rust and decay. Sarah led us through a maze of abandoned machinery and makeshift living quarters. Sleeping bags were scattered across the concrete floor, and crude wooden crosses hung from the ceiling beams. The walls were covered in scripture, but the verses had been twisted and rewritten in faded red paint. "Blessed are the broken, for they shall inherit submission," I read aloud from one wall. Sarah shuddered. "That was Brother Marcus's favorite," she said. "He made us recite it every morning before the purification rituals." Morrison's radio crackled. "We've got movement in the East Wing," came the voice of Sergeant Rodriguez. "Multiple heat signatures." Sarah grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "They're here. I told you they'd come back for me." But as we moved toward the East Wing, Sarah suddenly stopped. Her eyes had fixed on a door I hadn't noticed before, partially hidden behind a stack of wooden crates. Unlike everything else in the warehouse, this door looked recently used. "That wasn't here before," she said, her voice trembling. "That door, it's new." Morrison gestured for backup as he approached the door. The metal handle turned easily, too easily. Inside, we found something that made my blood run cold, a room that looked like it had been prepared specifically for Sarah's return. The space was clean, almost sterile. A simple bed sat against one wall, made up with crisp white sheets. On a small table, a plate of food sat waiting, still warm. But most disturbing were the photographs covering every inch of the walls, pictures of Sarah from the past 3 years since her escape, pictures of her at the grocery store, at my office, walking through her neighborhood. They'd been watching her every move. "Oh, God," Sarah breathed, stumbling backward. "They really are going to take me back." In the center of the room, a note waited on the pillow, written in the same careful script that had adorned the threatening letters. "The prodigal daughter returns to the fold. Your time in the wilderness ends tonight. The father forgives, but he does not forget. Room 23. Come alone, or others will pay the price of your defiance." Morrison was already coordinating with his team, but Sarah was shaking her head frantically. "You don't understand. If I don't go to them willingly, they'll disappear again. How many more children will they take? How many more lives will they destroy while you're searching for them?" "We're not using you as bait," I said firmly. "There has to be another way." But even as I spoke, we heard it. The sound of children singing, their voices echoing through the warehouse with haunting beauty. It was the same hymn Sarah had hummed during our first session, the one that had triggered her most painful memories. "The ceremony," Sarah whispered. "They're beginning the ceremony. Those children—" Her face went white. "They have children here. Right now." The singing grew louder, more urgent. Morrison spoke rapidly into his radio, calling for additional units, but we all knew that by the time backup arrived, the cult members could scatter like smoke. They'd done it before. Sarah straightened her shoulders, and I saw something change in her expression. The fear was still there, but it was being pushed aside by something stronger: determination. "I know this building better than any of them," she said. "I know every hiding place, every exit, every room where they might be keeping those children. But I have to go in first. I have to make them think I'm surrendering." "Sarah, no," I started, but she was already moving toward the door. 20 years, she said, turning back to face us. 20 years they stole from me. I won't let them steal 20 more from someone else." The singing reached a crescendo, then stopped abruptly. In the sudden silence, we heard footsteps approaching from multiple directions. Slow, measured, purposeful. They knew we were here. Morrison drew his weapon as shadows began to move in the corridors around us. Sarah looked at me one last time, her eyes holding a mixture of terror and resolve that I'll never forget. "Room 23, she whispered. "Give me 5 minutes, then come find me." Before either of us could stop her, she stepped into the darkness beyond the doorway, walking toward the very nightmare she'd spent 3 years trying to escape. The warehouse stood silent in the pre-dawn darkness, its broken windows like dead eyes, staring out at the abandoned industrial district. Sarah pressed herself against the cold brick wall, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. 3 weeks had passed since our last meeting. 3 weeks of careful planning and coordination with Detective Morrison's task force. "They're here," she whispered into the radio clipped to her jacket. Her voice was steady now, transformed from the trembling woman who had first sat across from me in that coffee shop. The fear was still there. I could see it in the tight line of her shoulders, but it was tempered by something stronger: purpose. Through the cracked window, we could see the figures moving inside. Robes, candles, the unmistakable ritual setup that Sarah had described in horrifying detail during our sessions. Elder Marcus stood at the center, his gaunt frame casting long shadows across the concrete floor. Even from this distance, his presence radiated the same magnetic authority that had controlled Sarah's life for 20 years. "Remember, we need him alive," Morrison's voice crackled through the earpiece. "He's the only one who knows where the other compounds are located." Sarah's jaw clenched. I knew what this cost her. The restraint required to capture rather than eliminate the man who had stolen her childhood, who had convinced her she was worthless, who had used her body and mind as instruments of his twisted faith. But she had insisted on being here, on facing this moment. Healing, she had told me, sometimes required walking through fire. The tactical team was positioned around the perimeter, but Sarah had been adamant about one thing: she would be the one to go in first. She knew their patterns, their blind spots, their psychological weaknesses. More importantly, she needed to prove to herself that she could face them without running. There, Sarah pointed to a service entrance, partially hidden by overgrown weeds. That's how I got out the last time I tried to escape, before they caught me and she didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. As we moved toward the entrance, Sarah's breathing became controlled, methodical. It was a technique we had practiced extensively, grounding exercises to prevent dissociation when confronted with trauma triggers. Her hand found the small recording device in her pocket, the one that would capture Marcus's confession. Everything had to be done legally, properly. Too many victims had been failed by the system already. The door opened with barely a whisper. Inside, the familiar stench hit us immediately, unwashed bodies, burning herbs, and something else, something rotting. Sarah's step faltered for just a moment before she pressed forward. The main ceremony hall opened before us, and I felt my own stomach lurch. 37 people knelt in concentric circles around Marcus, their faces blank with the glazed devotion I had read about but never witnessed. But it was the smaller forms scattered among them that made my blood run cold. Children, some no older than 8 or 9. Marcus's voice echoed through the space, weaving the same hypnotic patterns Sarah had described. But as his words reached us, I saw something I hadn't expected. Sarah wasn't frozen by fear or triggered into flashback. Instead, her expression hardened with crystalline clarity. "He's weaker than I remembered," she murmured. "Listen to his voice. There's desperation there. He knows his time is running out." She was right. The commanding presence that had once held absolute sway over dozens of followers now carried an edge of panic. The FBI raids on 2 other compounds had clearly shaken him. His flock was diminishing, his power waning. Sarah stepped into the light. The effect was immediate and electric. Marcus stopped mid-sentence, his face cycling through shock, rage, and something that might have been fear. Several followers turned to look, confusion breaking through their programmed compliance. "Hello, Father," Sarah said, her voice carrying clearly across the space. The title dripped with irony and newfound strength. "I've come home." For a moment, the warehouse was utterly silent except for the drip of water somewhere in the darkness. Then Marcus's face transformed into the mask of benevolent authority I had heard so much about. "Sarah, my dear child, you've returned to us at last. I knew you would see the error of your ways." But as he stepped toward her, Sarah didn't retreat. Instead, she smiled, expression of pure, hard-won freedom. "I have returned," she agreed, "but not as your child, as your judge." The recording device was running. The tactical teams were moving into position, and for the first time in 20 years, Sarah stood in the presence of her tormentor not as a victim, but as a survivor who had chosen to reclaim her power. Marcus reached out his hand, expecting the automatic submission he had programmed into her. Instead, Sarah raised her own hand, not to accept his touch, but to signal the teams. The warehouse erupted in coordinated chaos as the raid began, but through it all, Sarah stood perfectly still, finally free.